Two police officers received a report about strange noises coming from an abandoned house. When they arrived and began to investigate, a terrifying scene unfolded before their eyes. Silver Creek was a town that wore its silence like a shroud. Under the cloak of night, the narrow alleys whispered secrets to the shadows, and the dim streetlights flickered, fighting against the encroaching darkness. At the police station, Jack Turner and Emily Foster were midway through their night shift. The desk phone rang, slicing through the quiet air. Jack picked up, his expression tightening as he listened. A voice, hurried and tense, spoke of strange noises coming from an old, abandoned house on the outskirts. Emily glanced at him as he hung up. "What was it?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. "Something's off," Jack muttered, grabbing his coat. "Sounds coming from that old place near Pine Street." Emily nodded, reaching for her flashlight. "Let's check it out." The drive was short, the night air cold enough to bite through their uniforms. The house loomed ahead, a silhouette of decay against the backdrop of trees. Its windows were shattered, gaping holes like vacant eyes staring into the void. They stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under their boots the only sound. Emily moved to the front door, her flashlight cutting through the murky interior. Jack was right behind her, his senses heightened. "Stay close," he murmured, the caution in his voice evident. They entered slowly, the door creaking on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dampness and rot. Dust motes floated in the beam of their flashlights, swirling with each step they took. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and somewhere in the darkness, a faint, rustling sound echoed. Jack scanned the room, his flashlight catching glimpses of torn wallpaper and broken furniture. Emily moved towards a doorway on the left, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something on the floor. A thin trail of what looked like dirt led into the next room. She gestured for Jack to follow. As they entered, Emily's flashlight swept across the far corner, and then she froze. "Jack!" she whispered, her voice tight. Jack turned his beam to where she was looking, and his breath hitched. In the corner, huddled together on the cold, dirty floor, were two children. The older one, a girl no more than 11, was cradling a smaller child in her arms. Both were shivering, their faces pale and gaunt. Their clothes were tattered, mere rags clinging to their frail bodies. Jack swallowed hard. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. He knelt down slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Hey," he said gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay. We're here to help." The older girl flinched, tightening her hold on the younger one. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting between Jack and Emily. For a moment it seemed like she might bolt, but her gaze locked onto Emily, who had knelt down beside Jack. Emily's face softened, her eyes full of empathy. "We're not going to hurt you," she assured them, keeping her voice calm. "Can you tell us your names?" The girl remained silent, her lips trembling. Jack noticed how she positioned herself slightly in front of the smaller child, as if to shield her from whatever threat they perceived. His heart clenched at the sight. This young girl, barely old enough to understand the world, was trying to protect her sister from its cruelty. Emily took a slow breath, sensing their hesitation. She glanced at Jack, who gave a subtle nod. They needed to be patient. "It's all right if you don't want to talk," Emily said softly. "But you're safe now." The older girl looked down at her sister, who had buried her face into her chest, clinging to her with frail fingers. She then looked back at Emily and Jack, her eyes pleading, though her lips remained sealed. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with unspoken fear and the weight of their suffering. Jack slowly reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Turner," he said quietly, his eyes still on the children. "We need medical assistance at the abandoned house on Pine Street. 2 minors. Condition unknown, but critical." Emily edged closer, just enough to drape her jacket over the children without touching them directly. The older girl's eyes followed her every movement, wary, but no longer as frightened. Emily kept her voice soft. "We're going to get you somewhere warm, all right?" The girl gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Jack and Emily exchanged a glance, one of determination and silent promise. They would find out what had happened to these children, and more importantly, who had let it happen. Inside the hospital was a flurry of movement. Nurses and doctors surrounded the children, their voices calm but hurried. Emily and Jack stepped back, watching as the kids were taken to an examination room. The door closed, leaving them in a sterile hallway filled with the scent of antiseptic. Jack glanced at Emily. "Think they'll talk?" he asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but they've been through something. Something bad." Hours passed. Emily and Jack waited, a silent vigil in the hospital corridor. Occasionally, a nurse would come out giving them updates on the children's physical condition, severe malnourishment, signs of exposure to cold, minor injuries. But nothing explained the hollowness in their eyes, the way they clung to each other in silence. When the doctors finally allowed them in, the scene was almost identical to the one in the abandoned house. The older girl was sitting on the bed, holding her little sister close. Both stared at the window, as if it offered an escape from this reality. Emily approached slowly, pulling a chair next to the bed. "Hi," she said gently, keeping her distance. "I'm Emily, and this is Jack. We're here to help you." The girls didn't respond. Emily waited, giving them time, but the silence stretched thin. She exchanged a glance with Jack, who stood at the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets. He nodded slightly. They wouldn't push it today. The following days unfolded in much the same manner. Emily visited every evening after her shift. She brought small gifts, a stuffed animal, a picture book. She never forced conversation, merely sat nearby and spoke softly about the world outside, stories of the town, the trees turning orange in the fall. Sometimes she would leave snacks on the bedside table, simple things like crackers or fruit, hoping they might feel a bit more at ease. Jack watched her from the doorway each time, the crease in his brow deepening with every visit. "They need time," Emily would say when he asked how things were going. "We can't rush them." It was the third day when she noticed the older girl, Lily, glancing at the stuffed animal she had left on the chair. It was small, a worn, floppy-eared rabbit. Emily pretended not to notice, continuing to talk in her soft, even tone. And the leaves are so bright this time of year," she was saying. "You'd like the park downtown. It's full of trees, and there's this big fountain in the middle." Lily's eyes flicked to the rabbit again, then to her sister, who was dozing against her. Emily's heart leapt, but she kept her expression neutral. She stood up slowly, moved the rabbit closer to the bed, and then stepped back. "You can hold it if you want," she said quietly. "Or not. It's up to you." For the first time, the girl's hand moved. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and pulled the rabbit onto the bed. Emily swallowed hard, fighting the surge of emotion. This was the first crack in the wall of silence they had been facing. The days blurred together, each one a test of patience. Emily came, she talked, she left small gifts, and gradually Lily began to respond, not with words but with tiny gestures. She would shift slightly when Emily entered the room, her eyes less vacant, sometimes following Emily's movements as she spoke. One evening, nearly a week later, Emily sat down in her usual chair. Jack had stopped by earlier but had left, giving them space. Emily was recounting a mundane story about her day, more to fill the silence than anything else. And then Officer Miller spilled his coffee all over the report he was working on. You should have seen his face. He's clumsy. Emily stopped. The voice was small, almost inaudible. She looked at Lily, who was staring down at the rabbit in her lap. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. Yes, she replied carefully. He is. Very clumsy. Silence again, but this time it was different. It was charged with something new. Hope, maybe. Emily waited, her heart pounding. Lily glanced at her sister, then back at Emily. My name is Lily, she said, her voice trembling. And that's Sarah. Emily nodded slowly, keeping her voice even. It's nice to meet you, Lily. And Sarah. The dam had a crack. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The hospital room was quiet except for the occasional beep of the monitors. Emily sat in her usual chair near the bed, flipping through a picture book as Lily watched, her eyes slightly more alert than they had been days ago. Sarah was asleep, her small form curled against her sister's side, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Emily looked up, catching Lily's gaze. I used to read this book when I was little, she said, her voice calm. It was my favorite. Lily didn't respond right away. She simply watched Emily, a guarded look on her face. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Mum used to read to us, she murmured, almost as if testing the words on her tongue. Emily remained quiet, giving Lily space to continue. She had learned that the girl needed time, that pushing would only drive her back into silence. She said she had to go away, Lily added, her voice barely audible. She promised she'd come back. Emily felt a chill creep up her spine. There it was, the sliver of truth they'd been waiting for. Where did she go? Emily asked gently. Lily's eyes darted to the window, staring at the grey sky outside. She didn't tell us, just that it was important. A secret. Emily nodded slowly, her mind racing. Your mum... What's her name, Lily? Lily hesitated, then whispered, Jessica. Jessica Rodriguez. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The name meant nothing to her, but the look on Lily's face told a different story. There was more here, something dark and unsettling. She needed to know more, but not here. Not now. Do you remember when she left? Emily asked, her voice steady. Lily glanced down at her sister, her eyes glazing over with a mix of emotions. Months ago. She left us in that house. Said it was safe. Safe. Emily suppressed a shiver. How could that place, that dilapidated ruin, be considered safe for two young children? She kept her expression neutral, knowing that Lily was watching her reaction closely. She gave us food, Lily continued, her voice strained. Told me to look after Sarah. But she didn't come back. I waited. Emily reached out, placing a hand on the edge of the bed, close enough to show support, but not too close to make Lily feel cornered. You did a good job taking care of your sister, she said quietly. Lily's eyes flicked to Emily, a glimmer of anguish breaking through her guarded exterior. She promised, Lily choked out, she promised she'd come back. Emily's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Sometimes, things happen that we can't control, she said, her tone soft but firm. It's not your fault. Lily didn't reply. She turned her gaze back to the window, her small hands clutching the blanket. Emily knew they were done for today. She stood up slowly, making sure not to disturb Sarah. I'll be back tomorrow, Emily said. If you want to talk more, I'll be here. Lily gave a small nod, her eyes still fixed on the sky. Emily left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. She found Jack in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Did she say anything? He asked, his voice low. Emily exhaled, the tension settling into her shoulders. Her mother's name is Jessica Rodriguez, she replied. She left them in that house months ago, told them she'd come back. Jack's jaw tightened. And she didn't. No, Emily said, shaking her head. Lily doesn't know why. Jack stared at the door for a moment, then turned to Emily. We need to find out what happened to her, he said grimly. Something's not right. Emily nodded. I'll start digging into any missing persons reports, see if her name comes up. Maybe she was involved in something. Jack sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. I hate this, he muttered. These kids, they've been through hell. Yeah, Emily agreed, her voice somber. And we need to figure out who put them there. They spent the next few hours back at the station, sifting through databases, searching for any mention of Jessica Rodriguez. Emily sifted through the files they had on Jessica. Every new piece of information made the picture clearer and more disturbing. Jessica Rodriguez had been an undercover investigator, specializing in cases involving child exploitation. The last trail she left pointed to a dilapidated orphanage on the outskirts of Silver Creek. It had once been a reputable institution, but now it was a husk of its former self, a place people avoided and barely spoke about. An orphanage, Jack muttered, looking at the old photograph of the building. Why am I not surprised? She was getting close to something, Emily replied, studying the image. This place, it's hiding something, I can feel it. They decided to pay the orphanage a visit. As they approached, the building loomed, a forgotten relic against the grey sky. Its walls were weathered and cracked, the paint peeling away in strips. Windows were clouded with grime, and the surrounding grounds were overgrown with weeds. A chill hung in the air, making the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. Jack glanced at her. Ready? Emily nodded, though unease gnawed at her. They walked up the broken path to the front door. Jack knocked, the sound echoing hollowly. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, thin man with deep-set eyes. His face was gaunt, his expression unreadable. Can I help you? His voice was a low murmur, almost a whisper. We're with the Silver Creek Police Department, Jack said, showing his badge. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the orphanage. The man's eyes flickered, just for a second, before he stepped aside to let them in. I'm Mr. Harvey, the director, he introduced himself curtly. Please, follow me. He led them into a small office that reeked of mildew. The walls were lined with dusty books, and an old computer sat on the desk, its screen dark. Emily glanced around, noting the dim lighting and the oppressive atmosphere. The entire place felt like a tomb, holding secrets that didn't want to be disturbed. How can I assist the police? Harvey asked, as he took his seat behind the desk. Jack began with routine questions about the orphanage's operations, the number of children, funding, and staff. Harvey answered in clipped sentences, his gaze never lingering too long on either of them. Emily watched him closely, sensing an underlying tension. He was guarded, and his words were too calculated, as if he had rehearsed them. While Jack continued the questioning, Emily scanned the room. Her eyes settled on the computer. If Jessica had been here, if she had found something, it would be in that machine, but how to get to it? As if on cue, Harvey's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his lips pressing into a thin line. Excuse me, he muttered, standing up. I need to take this call. Please make yourselves comfortable. He left the room, closing the door behind him. Emily's heart raced. This was her chance. She moved quickly, pulling a small device from her pocket and plugging it into the computer's USB port. What are you doing? Jack whispered, his eyes wide. Just a little insurance, Emily murmured, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The device blinked to life, silently transmitting data back to their station. "We need to know what he's hiding." Jack kept an ear on the door while Emily worked. Seconds felt like minutes, every sound amplified in the tense silence of the room. Emily's hands moved with practiced precision, navigating the computer's files as quickly as she could without drawing attention. "He's coming back," Jack hissed. Emily yanked the device out, slipping it into her pocket just as the door swung open. Harvey re-entered, his expression unchanged. He sat back down, eyeing them with the same detached demeanor. Emily forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Harvey," she said. "We appreciate your cooperation." Harvey nodded curtly. "Of course, if you need anything else, you know where to find me." They left the office, the air outside feeling lighter despite the encroaching dusk. Emily glanced at Jack as they walked back to their car. "Did you get it?" he asked, his voice low. Emily nodded. "It's transmitting to the station now. We'll know soon enough what he's hiding." As they drove away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister lay behind the orphanage's decayed facade. Whatever it was, Jessica had gotten too close. And now, so had they. Jack sat at his desk, the glow of the computer screen casting sharp shadows across his face. The files Emily had pulled from the orphanage director's computer filled the screen, each document more unsettling than the last. Names, dates, coded transactions, they all pointed to the unthinkable. The orphanage was involved in child trafficking, selling children to criminal organizations under the guise of adoption and sponsorship programs. "This is worse than we thought," Jack muttered, scrolling through the data. He rubbed his temples, the weight of their discovery pressing down on him. They were no longer dealing with just a missing person case. This was a criminal network, one that had likely been operating for years right under everyone's noses. Emily entered the room, her eyes catching Jack's grim expression. "Did you find something?" she asked, though the tension in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Jack looked up, his jaw clenched. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "It's all here. Records of transactions, false documents, everything. They're not just housing these kids, they're selling them." Emily felt a wave of nausea. She had suspected something terrible, but seeing the cold, hard evidence made it real. "We need to take this to the higher-ups," she said, though her voice wavered. "This is bigger than just us." "Agreed," Jack replied. He was about to reach for the phone when it rang. He hesitated, then picked it up. Turner. There was silence on the other end, then a voice, distorted and mechanical. "You need to stop," it said, "or else." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the line went dead. He stared at the receiver, a cold shiver running down his spine. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a threat. They were being watched. Emily's eyes widened as she saw Jack's face pale. "What was that?" she asked. "Anonymous call," Jack said, his voice tight. "They're onto us." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced toward the window, the blinds half drawn. Suddenly the room felt too exposed, too vulnerable. "We need to be careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they know we're digging into this, they won't hesitate." As the days went on, the threats grew more palpable. Emily noticed a black car parked near her apartment on multiple occasions, always leaving as soon as she tried to approach it. At night, her phone would ring, only for the caller to hang up the moment she answered. She began to feel the prickling sensation of eyes on her whenever she stepped outside. Jack wasn't spared either. He received more calls, each more sinister than the last. Once, a brick was thrown through his living room window, A note attached. "Back off, or you're next." Emily's anxiety skyrocketed. Her thoughts constantly drifted back to Lily and Sarah. They were safe at a protective custody facility for now, but for how long? She found herself double-checking the locks, glancing over her shoulder every time she walked down the hallway at the station. One evening, as Emily was leaving the precinct, she noticed a figure in the shadows across the street. Her breath caught, and she stopped, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm. The figure remained still, unmoving. Was it a watcher, or just someone passing by? "Emily?" Jack's voice cut through her mounting fear. He had stepped out behind her, noticing her sudden freeze. She glanced at him, then back to the shadows. The figure was gone. I thought I saw something," she muttered, feeling foolish. Jack scanned the area, his eyes narrowing. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his tone steady but grim. "We can't let them." Emily nodded, though her nerves were frayed. "It's not just about us," she said quietly. "It's about the kids. And Jessica, if she's still alive." Jack nodded. "We're not backing down," he said, his resolve hardening. "They want us to stop because we're close to something. We need to push harder." Emily took a deep breath, feeling a surge of determination. They couldn't let fear dictate their actions. Lives were at stake, and every moment they hesitated was another moment those kids remained in danger. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice firm despite the undercurrent of fear. "For Lily and Sarah. For Jessica." Jack gave a single nod. "For all of them." Together they turned back to the precinct, the looming darkness of the conspiracy hanging over them like a storm cloud. The danger was real, immediate, but so was their resolve. They would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. Jack adjusted his black jacket, the fabric rustling in the cold night air. Emily was beside him, her eyes fixed on the looming shadow of the orphanage. It was nearly midnight, and the building stood silent, shrouded in darkness. They had waited for this moment, watching the place for days to understand its routines, when it was most vulnerable. "You sure about this?" Jack whispered, glancing at Emily. She nodded, her face set in determination. "It's our only shot. We need hard evidence, and it's in there." They moved silently across the grounds, sticking to the shadows. The main entrance was too risky, so they circled to the side of the building where a window, slightly ajar, offered them a way in. Jack went first, easing it open further and slipping inside. Emily followed, landing softly on the dusty floor. The interior was pitch black, the air thick with mildew and neglect. They pulled out flashlights, the narrow beams cutting through the darkness. The hallway stretched ahead, a labyrinth of closed doors and silence. Jack led the way, his movements cautious but purposeful. They reached the office where they had spoken with Mr. Harvey days before. Jack pulled a set of lockpicks from his pocket, working quickly on the door. It clicked open with a soft snap, and they slipped inside. Emily's heart pounded as they moved to the desk. She booted up the computer they had seen earlier, connecting a portable drive to copy whatever they could find. As the files began to transfer, Jack opened a drawer, his flashlight revealing stacks of papers, folders thick with documents. "Look at this," he muttered, pulling out a file and flipping it open. His breath caught. Inside were photographs, children's faces staring blankly at the camera, each tagged with a name and a date. These are the kids, the ones they took. Emily glanced over, her throat tightening. There were dozens of them, some just infants, others barely teenagers. "It's a catalogue," she said, disgust thickening her voice. They're inventorying them like products. She forced herself to keep searching, opening another drawer. Inside, a ledger detailed transactions, each line a chilling reminder of what this place was: a marketplace for stolen lives. Jack moved to the file cabinet in the corner, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled it open. What he found made him freeze. "Emily," he whispered, his voice strained. She joined him, and her flashlight revealed the contents: birth certificates, adoption forms, all falsified. But the names, the sheer number of names, made her stomach turn. These were the children that had disappeared, their identities erased, replaced with new ones for the buyers. Emily's eyes stung. This wasn't just a crime, it was a systematic erasure of humanity. "How could they do this?" she muttered, the words barely audible. "How could they treat them like nothing?" Jack remained silent, his face grim. He shifted through the documents until he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a list, recent and detailed, of current inventory. And among the names was a familiar one: Jessica Rodriguez. "They have her," he said, the anger boiling beneath his calm tone. "She's here, somewhere." Emily looked at the list, her heart clenching. They had to find her, had to put an end to this. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a heavy door at the back. "That leads somewhere," she said. Jack nodded, moving to the door. It was locked, but he broke it open with a well-placed kick. Inside was a staircase leading down, a basement hidden from the world above. They descended slowly, each step echoing in the narrow space. The air grew colder, thicker, until they reached the bottom. Emily's flashlight swept across the room, revealing rows of metal cages. Most were empty, but some had remnants: blankets, toys, signs of hurried departure. Jack approached a wall, his flashlight catching on something glimmering. He picked it up. A bracelet, small and pink, a child's name etched into the metal: Sarah. Emily choked back a sob. "We have to get them out," she whispered. "All of them." They moved quickly, gathering as much evidence as they could, documenting every inch of the room. The horror of it fueled their resolve. They had found the heart of the operation, the place where lives were traded like commodities, and they had found the proof they needed. Jack pocketed a file detailing Jessica's transfer to another facility, somewhere within the network they had unearthed. It was their next lead, their next move. "We can't wait," Emily said, her voice trembling with urgency. "We go after her. Now." Jack nodded. "Agreed. But first we take this to the captain. We need backup, a full takedown." They climbed back up, the orphanage's sinister silence now a cacophony in their minds. They had stepped into the darkness, and now they had to drag every last shadow into the light. The air was heavy inside the police van, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Emily checked her gear for the third time, her fingers moving automatically over the straps and clasps. Jack was across from her, his face set in a grim line. The rest of the tactical team sat between them, all wearing the same look of focused determination. "This place is fortified," Jack said, breaking the silence. "They're expecting trouble." Emily nodded, her eyes on the map spread across her lap. "We get in, get Jessica out, and secure the location. No delays." Captain Harris, leading the operation, gave a final nod as the van came to a stop. "We go in hard and fast," he ordered. "No one gets left behind." The team moved out, slipping through the darkness toward the old asylum that stood at the end of a narrow, tree-lined road. Its silhouette was ominous, the windows darkened, hiding whatever horrors lay inside. They knew the layout from the files they had stolen. Multiple wings, a maze of corridors, and most likely a hidden section where Jessica was being held. They split into two groups. Emily and Jack led the first, while the second team circled around the back. Emily's heart pounded as they approached the entrance. Jack signaled, and a breaching charge was set on the door. The explosion was muffled, just enough to blast the door open without alerting the entire building. They moved in, weapons raised, sweeping the dimly lit corridor. "Clear," Jack whispered, leading them deeper inside. They encountered resistance quickly. Guards, armed and prepared, poured into the hallway. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing off the concrete walls. Emily and Jack pressed forward, taking cover behind a row of metal lockers. Jack fired back, each shot precise. "We need to push through," Emily urged, her voice tense but steady. With coordinated movements, they advanced, the tactical team covering each other's flanks. The guards fell back, retreating into the depths of the asylum. Emily and Jack continued, navigating the narrow hallways, each turn bringing them closer to where Jessica was supposed to be. "Down here," Jack muttered, gesturing to a stairwell that led to the lower levels. It was dark, the kind of darkness that pressed in on you. They descended cautiously, every step deliberate, every sound amplified in the silence. At the bottom, a heavy steel door barred their way. Jack set another charge. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, and they surged forward, entering what looked like a holding area. Emily froze. The room was lined with cells, each one more claustrophobic than the last. And in one of them, slumped against the wall, was Jessica. Her appearance was haunting. She was skeletal, her skin a sickly pale. Her hair hung in matted clumps around her face. She didn't move, didn't react to their entry. Her eyes were open, but they were empty, staring at nothing. "Jessica!" Emily called, her voice breaking. No response. Emily rushed to the cell, her hands fumbling to unlock the door. When it swung open, she knelt beside Jessica, touching her shoulder gently. "Jessica, it's Emily. We're here to get you out." Jessica's eyes flickered, a faint sign of life, but they remained unfocused. Emily felt a lump in her throat. She was looking at a woman who had been shattered, broken beyond recognition. "Jack, we need to move her now," Emily said, urgency creeping into her voice. Jack nodded, calling for the medics who were waiting upstairs. Emily carefully helped Jessica to her feet. The woman was light, almost weightless in Emily's arms, and every movement seemed to cause her pain. Emily could feel the frailty of Jessica's bones, the tremor of her malnourished body. "It's okay. You're safe now," Emily whispered, though she doubted Jessica could understand. They moved quickly, the team surrounding them as they made their way back through the building. More guards appeared, but the tactical unit held them off, allowing Emily and Jack to push forward. The escape was frantic, chaotic, but they reached the exit, the cold night air hitting them like a slap in the face. Jessica was loaded into an ambulance, Emily holding her hand tightly until the paramedics took over. She watched as they worked, shouting commands, administering fluids and oxygen. Jack stood beside her, his expression a mix of relief and fury. "She's alive," he said, his voice rough. "But look at what they did to her." Emily nodded, swallowing hard. "They'll pay for this," she replied, her eyes fixed on Jessica's gaunt face. "Every last one of them." As the ambulance doors closed, taking Jessica to the hospital, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. They had saved her, but the cost was staggering. Jessica's blank eyes, her silence, those were the marks of what they were fighting against. Jessica sat propped up in the hospital bed, her face still gaunt, but her eyes no longer hollow. Emily sat beside her, a notebook in her lap, while Jack stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed. They had been waiting for this moment, for Jessica to be strong enough to tell her story. "It started right after they took me," Jessica began, her voice thin but steady. "They drugged me, tried to make me forget why I was there, but I knew, even through the fog. I heard things, saw things." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What did they do to you?" she asked softly. "They would come in with needles," Jessica said, her gaze drifting to the window. "Inject me with something that made my mind slow. They'd ask questions, and when I wouldn't answer, they'd hurt me." Jack's jaw tightened, the lines on his face hardening. "Did they know you were an investigator?" Jessica nodded. "They found out quickly. I had records, information about their operation. They tried to break me, to make me forget. But the worst part wasn't what they did to me. It was what they were doing to the children." Emily held her breath, bracing herself for what was to come. "Tell us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica closed her eyes, as if to gather strength. The orphanage was a front. They took in children, but not to care for them. They were selling them, sending them off to different places, factories, sweatshops, even to places where no child should ever be. Emily felt a wave of nausea, the horror of it clawing at her chest. She thought of Lily and Sarah, alone in that abandoned house, their mother taken because she had tried to stop this nightmare. "They used adoption as a cover," Jessica continued. "False paperwork, false names. They'd move the kids through different channels, making them disappear. Once they were gone, no one could find them. They erased their identities, their existence." Jack's fists clenched, his face contorted with rage. "They treated them like property," he said through gritted teeth. "They took everything from them." Jessica nodded, her expression bleak. "I overheard them talking. The children, they weren't just sold. They were forced into labor, made to work in conditions you wouldn't wish on anyone. Some were sent to places where they would never be found again." Emily's hands shook as she took notes, her mind struggling to process the enormity of it all. "How many?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How many children?" Jessica looked down, her shoulders slumping. "Dozens. Maybe more. I couldn't keep track. They had a network, different places where they sent the kids. It was like a machine, soulless, efficient." A silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Emily's mind flashed with images of the children they had seen in the files, their faces staring blankly at the camera. She thought of Lily and Sarah again, how close they had come to being part of this monstrous system. Jack turned away, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. Emily could see the tension in his posture, the fury he was trying to contain. "They'll pay for this," he said, his voice low, barely controlled. Jessica reached out, her hand weakly grasping Emily's. "You have to stop them," she whispered. "They're still out there, still taking children. They won't stop unless you make them." Emily squeezed Jessica's hand, her throat tightening. "We will," she promised. "We'll end this." Jack turned back, his eyes burning with resolve. "With your testimony and the evidence we gathered, we have enough to take them down," he said. "We'll hit every location, every contact they have." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, a glimmer of hope piercing through the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered. Emily stood, her legs feeling unsteady. "You did more than enough," she said, her voice breaking. "You gave us the key to stop them." As they left Jessica's room, the weight of what they had learned settled over them like a shroud. Emily felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over, thinking of the innocent lives lost, the children who had been torn from any semblance of a future. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "We're going to bring them down," he said. "All of them." They moved with purpose toward the precinct, the plan already forming in their minds. They would gather their team, prepare for the raid that would dismantle the entire network. The fight was far from over, but now they had the truth, and with it, the power to bring justice to those who had been voiceless for far too long. The operation was over. In the days that followed, the news spread quickly, an entire trafficking network dismantled, dozens of children rescued, and countless others spared a similar fate. The halls of the hospital were quiet, save for the soft beeping of monitors and the muted conversations of nurses moving between rooms. Jessica had been recuperating, her strength slowly returning. Emily stood outside Jessica's room, glancing through the small window in the door. Inside, Jessica sat up in bed, a faint color returning to her cheeks. Emily turned as Jack approached, two small figures trailing behind him. "Lily, Sarah," Emily whispered, dropping to one knee to meet their eyes. "Are you ready?" Lily nodded, her eyes wide and anxious. She clutched her little sister's hand tightly, her knuckles white. Sarah, still so young, looked up with a mixture of confusion and hope. Emily pushed open the door gently, and the room fell silent. Jessica turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes widened as she saw her daughters standing there, frozen for a moment, as if afraid this was just another cruel trick. "Mom?" Lily's voice was a choked whisper. Jessica's face crumpled. "Lily, Sarah." Her voice broke as she held out her arms. The two girls didn't hesitate any longer. They ran across the room, flinging themselves into their mother's embrace. The impact nearly toppled Jessica, but she clung to them, her frail arms wrapping around their small bodies as if she would never let go. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their sobs, raw, unfiltered cries that filled the room. It was a symphony of grief and joy, a cathartic release of everything they had held inside. Jessica buried her face in Lily's hair, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she kept repeating, her voice muffled. "I'm so sorry." Lily hugged her tighter, her small frame shaking. "You came back," she said through her tears. "You promised you would. And you did." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She stood beside Jack, watching the scene unfold, her heart swelling and breaking simultaneously. They had brought this family back together, but they couldn't erase what had been lost, the innocence, the time, the pain. Jack glanced at Emily, his eyes shining with a mix of emotions he rarely showed. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice rough. "We saved them." Emily nodded, unable to speak. She felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched Jessica rock back and forth, holding her daughters close, whispering words of comfort and love. It was a sight she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a reminder of why they fought, why they refused to back down. After what felt like an eternity, Jessica pulled back, cupping Lily's face in her hands, then Sarah's. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you both so much." "We love you too, Mom," Lily replied, her voice steadying. Emily and Jack stepped back, giving the family a moment of privacy. They moved into the hallway, leaning against the wall, the gravity of everything catching up to them. "You think they'll be okay?" Emily asked, her voice barely a murmur. Jack let out a slow breath. "They have a long road ahead," he admitted. "But they have each other. That's more than a lot of people get." Weeks passed and Jessica grew stronger. She and her daughters moved into a small house in town, starting to rebuild the life that had been so violently shattered. Emily and Jack visited often, bringing groceries, checking in. They became a part of each other's lives, woven together by the threads of tragedy and triumph. On one visit, Emily watched as Jessica planted flowers in the front yard, Sarah playing nearby, giggling as she chased a butterfly. Lily helped her mother, her hands dirt-streaked, but her face alight with a happiness that Emily hadn't seen before. It was a simple scene, but it held the weight of something monumental, the quiet strength of survival, the promise of new beginnings. Jack stood beside Emily, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "They're healing," he said. Emily nodded, a soft smile spreading across her face. "So are we," she replied. Life moved forward. The scars would remain, faint lines etched into their lives, reminders of the darkness they had faced. But there was light now, too. In the laughter of the children, in the quiet resilience of Jessica, and in the unwavering determination of Emily and Jack. The world was still a dangerous place, full of shadows. But standing there, watching a mother and her daughters reclaim their lives, Emily knew they would keep fighting those shadows, for every family torn apart, for every child stolen away. Because sometimes they won. And those victories, however small, were worth everything. Wow, what a chilling and suspenseful journey we just went on together. From the eerie silence of that abandoned house to the ominous secrets hidden within the orphanage, it's clear that Emily and Jack have stumbled upon something far darker than they could have imagined. The tension, the mystery, and the lingering question: what really happened to Jessica Rodriguez? If you found this story gripping, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends who love a good detective thriller. And hey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think is hidden behind the orphanage's walls? Leave your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this unfolding mystery. Trust me, things are about to get even more intense. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay curious, everyone.